This one. Okay, great. Okay, I'll introduce you.
Okay.
I have a few announcements.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, hi everybody, and thank those of you who did come out to tonight's meeting. Hi Scotty, come in and have a seat. We were supposed to have a church group with us tonight, and they don't seem to be here yet, so we are getting started now. My name is Janice Rail. I am the founder and president of the Delaware Valley Chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and it's very nice that you guys came out tonight. Before we start, I have some announcements. This will be DVAU's final regular chapter meeting here in this room until March 3rd of 2016. We take a winter break. A lot of people don't come out in the winter time. So we just take a break until March 3rd, and then we'll meet here in this room again in March, April, and May. We are looking for meeting hosts to hold discussion groups in Philadelphia. If you are interested, please see me after the meeting. We did start a new discussion group in South Jersey on the first Sundays at the Coffee Works in the Ritz Center in Voorhees. We have a special price for brunch, $8.88. It's a very nice buffet. That's from 12:30 to 1:30. The actual DVAU meeting begins at 1:30. We talk about church-state issues until 2:30 or 3, and it is less than half an hour from the Ben Franklin Bridge, so if you have a car, come to Voorhees and join us. And finally, DVAU's big year-end bash will be held on Sunday, December 6th from 11 a.m. until 6 p.m. This special event is co-hosted by the Free Thought Society and the Ethical Humanist Society of Philadelphia at the Ethical Humanist Society building in Rittenhouse Square. We will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the intelligent design case Kitzmiller versus Dover. We will host lawyers from Pepper Hamilton who worked on the case, and author Lori Levo, the journalist who covered the case for the York Daily Record and later wrote a book about it called The Devil in Dover. The full event schedule is on our website at dvau.org. Tickets are on sale now for $30, which includes lunch. We also have an afternoon-only ticket for $15, and at the end of the evening there will be a cash bar with $5 wine and champagne when we come to a close. So please get your tickets now for December 6th. They are selling and space is limited. And of course there's more information on our website, dvau.org, where you can sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, and even research information about church-state separation and related issues. So now for our meeting. Our speaker tonight, who came all the way from New York, is Jonathan Engel, an attorney with expertise in American history and constitutional law, who presents his talk, Engle versus Vitale and the Separation of Church and State. Jonathan's late father, Steven Engel, was one of the plaintiffs in the landmark Supreme Court case Engle versus Vitale, 1962, where the court held that organized prayers in public schools were an impermissible violation of the Constitution's Establishment Clause. This case became the basis for several subsequent decisions limiting government-directed prayer in school. In Wallace versus Jaffrey, 1985, the Supreme Court ruled Alabama's law permitting 1 minute for prayer or meditation was unconstitutional. In Lee versus Weissman, 1992, the court prohibited clergy-led prayer at a middle school graduation ceremony. Lee versus Weissman, in turn, was a basis for Santa Fe ISD versus Doe in 2000, in which the court extended the ban to school-organized student-led prayer at high school football games. So teacher-led and coach-led prayer in public schools still takes place today in many towns. Just last week in Americans United's blog, AU's Simon Brown wrote about a high school football coach in Washington State who insists that he has the right to pray at football games and has been placed on paid leave, which could lead to a lawsuit. Brown's post says that this coach just can't flip a switch and stop being the football coach whenever he feels like it. That doesn't mean he can never pray, but it does mean he has the power to coerce public school students thanks to his position of authority, which is never greater than at a football game. Praying at the 50-yard line immediately after a game sends a message that players are expected to join in. Brown goes on to say that if the district allowed the coach to continue in his prayers, it would first need to allow other viewpoints to pray there as well and to stave off a First Amendment violation. Such a system would certainly be chaotic. The Seattle Satanic Temple is already excited about the opportunity. Please welcome Jonathan Engel as he tells us about the problems with school-led prayer, his father's 1962 case, and the status of the issue in America today. John.
very much, and thank you, Janice, and thank you for coming out today. I'd like to begin just a little bit by wishing everybody a happy Guy Fawkes night. I don't know if everybody realizes, but today is Guy Fawkes night in England, in the UK. And what do they do for Guy Fawkes night? Well, they celebrate the fact that Guy Fawkes was prevented from carrying out his plot and plot of his co-conspirators to blow up the Parliament building. And thereby, he was hoping that he would thereby lead to the overthrow of King James I. Now, why did Guy Fawkes and his fellow Catholic co-conspirators want to blow up the Parliament building and to overthrow King James I? Because King James I was Protestant. And so, that is another wonderful example of why it's a very good idea to separate church and state. I'm going to talk tonight again, basically about school prayer, and specifically about the case of Engel versus Vitale. The case of Engel versus Vitale was a United States Supreme Court case decided in 1962. It came out of the Herrick's School District, which is in New Hyde Park on Long Island in Nassau County in New York State, and it was the first case in which the court held that organized prayer in public schools were a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So we're going to start a little bit, just take a look at that clause in the First Amendment, which essentially says, with the Establishment Clause, and we have the Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, everything else, when it is a matter of interpretation, how do you interpret that law when it comes to specific acts in specific schools? Now, I want to talk about one more part of the Constitution, another clause, and that's Article 6, Paragraph 3. And Article 6, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution reads as follows. The senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out about this. One is that you notice the words oath or affirmation, because some people say, well, you know, when people become government officials, they swear to God, and frequently that they will uphold the Constitution, and they somehow misinterpret that as an oath to God, which it is not. It's an oath to the Constitution, but the framers of the Constitution specifically said that you could do it by affirmation. Nobody has to swear to God to take their position in the government. They can just simply affirm, under the penalty of perjury, that they agree to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And I think it's interesting that when you take out the amendments, this is the only, before the amendments were written, this is the only mention of religion in the Constitution. No religious test for public office and oath or affirmation in order to promise to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Another quick thing I want to mention about this is probably you all know, Dr. Ben Carson is running for president these days, so I'm told. He was recently asked whether the faith of a president or the person running for president should matter. And he replied, it depends on what that faith is. Now, Dr. Carson recently wrote, or somebody wrote a book and put his name on it, about the Constitution, and I think maybe it would have been a good idea for him to read it before he actually issued a book with his name on it that was about the Constitution. So I want to talk again very quickly here, before we get into the school prayer specifically, about a couple of writings of people who were the couple of founding fathers. It's not a phrase I'm crazy about. It's sort of, you know, you expect, oh, founding fathers, and, you know, these were human beings, many of them brilliant, not all of them, but many of them brilliant, but they were still human beings. And frequently when we talk about separation of church and state, we get into these dueling quotes kind of thing that I kind of like to avoid when I can about, well, so-and-so said this, but so-and-so said that about religion and religion in public life, etc. But I think that these particular writings are important. The first one I want to talk about, and especially important with regard to the Engle case. And the first one I want to talk about was written by James Madison, who of course was not only eventually President of the United States, but also the primary draftsman of the Constitution. And James Madison, this was his memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, which is a kind of a dry title, but hey, this was the 1700s. But what he said was, this was what the background, just a little bit, was that the state of Virginia, there was a proposition to levy a tax against all residents of the state that would be used specifically to support the Anglican clergy in Virginia. Now, the elites of Virginia were primarily Anglican, but at this time there were other religions were beginning to get a toehold in Virginia. When I say other religions, I'm not talking about Jews and Muslims and Hindus. We're talking about Baptists and Quakers, but they were still different, and some people saw it as a threat, and they said, well, what we need to do is assess a tax to support our good old Anglican clergy. But James Madison disagreed. And here's what he wrote, in part. He argued that government suffered when religion was established, and religion suffered when it got too close to government. And that's really important, and we're going to see that again when we get to the Engle case. He also wrote, who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3/10 only of his property for the support of only one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. And actually, these are the last words of the decision in the Engle case. And so, essentially, what Madison was saying was, beware. You know, you think that, oh, well, it's my religion, so what do I care if it's established by government? Well, you know what? Things change. And all of a sudden, if you're going to accept the fact that government can establish religion when it's yours, it's too late. When all of a sudden you find yourself in the minority because of demographic changes. The other document I want to talk about was a document written by George Washington, and it was a letter to the Touro Synagogue. Now, the Touro Synagogue is considered the oldest Jewish congregation, continuing Jewish congregation in the United States. It's located in Newport, Rhode Island. And in 1790, during his first term, President Washington took a trip to New England, including Rhode Island and Newport. And when he was in Newport, he was greeted by delegations of various groups in the city, including a delegation from Touro Synagogue. And they gave him a letter in which they thanked him for his good work for the country as commander of the Continental Army and also as president. And he replied in a letter to the congregation of Touro Synagogue. And here's what he said, in part. He said, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience. It's a very important phrase. Again, we'll get to that later. But he said, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For, happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Now, a couple things I want to point out here. One is that Washington was right. This was a new policy. Because if you look at the way Jews were treated in Europe at this time, primarily, frequently they had to live in segregated areas, in ghettos. They were restricted from what kind of occupations they could hold. But also, they were considered not real citizens of the countries they lived in. It was like, you can stay here for as long as we say you can stay here, but you're not really a Frenchman or a German or a Pole or a Hungarian. You're not really one of us. And if we ever decide that, you got to go, then you got to go. And, we know where that wound up. But Washington said, not here. Not in the United States. Here, all it requires is that you be a good citizen. And there's no requirement that you be a Christian. Remember, he knew he was talking to Jews. This letter was sent to the Touro Synagogue congregation. And he was saying, there's no requirement for that. And in a way, what he was doing was taking Article 6, paragraph paragraph 3, which applies to public office holders and says there's no religious test, and taking that to the level of the average citizen and saying there is also no religious test for citizenship in this country. Now, I want to move on because we've got a Supreme Court case to get to, but I want to talk a little bit about the history of religion in schools in this country. Again, just very briefly, but from about the founding of the country through about the mid-19th century, we were a very agrarian society, and we were a very homogeneous society. And the setup for many people was that, you know, there'd be a town that had a few small businesses, maybe a blacksmith shop or a general store, and also a church. And most of the people lived where it was an agrarian society. They were farmers, and they lived around the town. And if they wanted their kids to be educated, they sent them to the church. Because the system of public schools in this country hadn't really been established. So, but it wasn't a problem. It was at that time, again, it was homogeneous. Most people, that was their religion, whatever the church was. And so they really didn't feel, you know, there wasn't a lot of conflict in sending their kids to a school, you know, that was run by the church, in the school where they said Protestant prayers and they read from the Protestant King James Bible, etc. It was not really much of a conflict, and it was not really much of a problem. But then when we get into the mid-1800s, there are two things that come in that really kind of start changing that. And one was scientific, and one was more demographic and geographic and cultural. The scientific part was, of course, that in 1859, Charles Darwin published Origin of Species. And it changed the way people thought about education and religion in certain ways, because prior to publishing The Origin of Species, there were many people, scientists in fact, who said, you know, who agreed with the biblical description of how life, all life on this planet came to being. And there was really nothing to really contradict that. And so if you taught that in schools, you were teaching good science, at least for what it was at the time. But after publishing Origin of Species, all of a sudden that changes. And it's not quite that way anymore. And I just want to give a quote here from a gentleman named William Harris. From 1889 to 1906, he was the United States Education Commissioner. And he thought that devotion in school was inappropriate because academic instruction requires critical thinking, whereas worship demands unquestioning faith. And I think, you know, that can be, you know, held today, etc. That's, I mean, it's really a wonderful way of looking at it and seeing that it's not a question of either or, it's just a question of different way of teaching and a different way of looking at things. Now, the other societal change that I was mentioning were industrialization and immigration patterns. We're changing the nature of this country. Remember I said previously we had been a highly agrarian, rural, and homogeneous population. But no more. We have the Industrial Revolution. And people are leaving the farms to get work in factories. And the factories are by cities, or cities grow up around the factories to house the people who are living there. And so you have that change, the urbanization of America. At the same time, immigration patterns were changing the country tremendously because we were no longer so homogeneous. Now Catholics were moving to this country at the beginning largely from Ireland to escape the terrible famine in Ireland, but then later on from other countries as well. And you had Lutherans moving to this country mostly from Northern Europe, from Germany and Scandinavia, and you had Jews moving to this country mostly from Eastern Europe. And the immigrant experience was, you know, the same for many people. You came to this country, and what you did, you sought out your kinsmen. You sought out people who, you know, if there was if you were coming to New York City and you were German, you probably went to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which was called Germantown, and that's where a lot of Germans lived. Or if you were Jewish, you probably went to the Lower East Side, because that's where a lot of Jews live. Because first of all, you may not speak the language, so you need to be able to speak to people. And then these were your kinsmen. They'd show you the ropes. They'd show you, this is how you can get a job, this is where you can get a place to live, and this is where you're going to send your kids to school. Now, sending the kids to school was starting to become an issue, because instead of having, you know, that I mentioned, society, you send the kids to the church, school. Now, it's a little bit different. Now, you've got lots of people from different backgrounds and different cultures and different religions, and they're all in big cities, and they're sending their kids all to the same school. And so now, if you have prayers in the school, which at the time they still did, especially they were Protestant prayers, people started to get upset. And there was conflict regarding this. A lot of Catholic people were upset about sending their kids to a public school and having to start the day with a Protestant prayer and having Protestant readings through the day. They were very upset about this, and in fact, that's one of the things that led to one of the reactions among at least some Catholics in this country was the start of the system of parochial schools. So that their children wouldn't have to go to public schools where they were subjected to Protestant prayers and Protestant lessons. So people were upset about this, and they started to assert their rights. You know how it is with immigrants. Again, part of the immigrant experience frequently is that people come and at first they sort of keep their heads down. It's like, I don't want any trouble, I just want to, get along here. But after they've been here for a while and start to feel a little bit of ownership, a little bit of like, this is mine too, they start asserting their rights, and people started complaining about this kind of thing. And I want to talk about a Supreme Court case briefly from West Virginia. It's a 1943 case called West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. And what this case was about was that the state of West Virginia had passed a law that said that every child in the state of West Virginia must, it was mandatory, recite the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of the day. Now, some parents objected to this, and they brought a lawsuit. And their objection was on religious grounds. And so you might think, if they were objecting to the mandatory recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance on religious grounds, that they were objecting to the words under God. But I'm sure, as many of you know, this is 1943, the words under God were not in the Pledge of Allegiance at that time. So what did they object to? Well, these parents were Jehovah's Witnesses, and they believed, that was part of their religion, that you could not make that kind of pledge to any earthly entity. Only to God can you make that kind of pledge. You do not pledge to your country, you do not pledge to a flag, you only make that kind of pledge to God. And so they felt the fact that their children were compelled to make that pledge every morning violated their religious beliefs. And the court agreed and struck down the law. And Justice Robert Jackson wrote the decision, and he set forth what we would consider today to be freedom of conscience, which, remember, George Washington in his letter to Touro Synagogue said, all possess alike liberty of conscience. And Jackson went on to write, if there is a fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. And I think that was very important when it came to the Engle case, because remember what he's saying. No official, you can't prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, or religion, and force citizens to confess by word their act, or act their faith therein. Now, again, as we're moving forward in time here, we're into the 1940s, starting to get into the 1950s, and another important factor in the national debate about church and state, and especially school prayer, was now creeping in, and that was the Cold War and the fight against godless communism. It was considered, the Cold War was real. I mean, people really thought it was a really important thing. Nobody knew when a hot war was going to break out, and there was a lot of pressure for people to conform to the American way. And part of the American way, remember, the American way had to be in opposite to what the godless commies were doing. And so part of the American way was religion. But not just being religious in your own personal life, but all of us stating together our religion. There was a great press for conformity with regard to religion, and the schools were a perfect place to institute this. Now, by the way, it is, of course, at this time that under God, the words under God were added to the pledge. That was 1954. In 1958, The words "In God We Trust" were put on our paper money for the first time. It had been on some coins since the Civil War, but this was the first time it was on our paper money. And so there was this idea that in order to fight communism, we want our kids to be good fighters of communism, and so we want them to be praying, and what better place to get them to do it was in the schools. But there was also another reason why people favored prayer in the school at the time. There was concern about what they used to call juvenile delinquency. And in the 1950s, there were movies, I don't know, I'm old enough to remember, at least to see them, movies like Rebel Without a Cause and The Wild One and Blackboard Jungle, about these wild, crazy kids out of control. And so there was a belief is that, well, if we have them pray every morning, they'll behave better. There was no actual evidence of this or proof of this, but boy, we believed it, and so it must be true. So you can see what's going on here at the time. Opposing sets of principles. The Supreme Court had held, first of all, the 14th Amendment applied the constitutional protections to the states and actions by state governments, and the Supreme Court had held that the constitutional protections also applied to actions by local municipalities. And you can see that so people started to feel like they assert their rights. Now, if a local municipality does something that you feel violates your constitutional rights, you can sue in federal court to overturn them. And that was a really important thing. And you see that in the civil rights movement, late 40s, early 50s, the civil rights movement. Now, if your local school board segregates the schools and says separate, but it's separate but it's equal, now you can go into court. Brown versus Board of Education, right? You can go into court and say, no, my federal rights are being violated by this. So on the one hand, you had the idea that individuals could assert their individual rights with a certain level of individualism, regardless of what the majority said. And remember, constitutional rights are not subject to majority vote. But on the other hand, you had the Cold War, and the acting as the idea that we shouldn't be looking at individual things. We should be looking at conformity, and we should all be together on this. So it was really opposing values that were meeting head up in the Engle case. Now, let's get to the Engle case. The background. 1955, the New York State Board of Regents, by the way, the New York State Board of Regents is a governmental authority in the state of New York that's responsible for public education, everything from preschool through the state university system. And they brought together priests, ministers, and rabbis to write a prayer. And you might wonder what the state of New York is doing in the prayer writing business, and you will see the Supreme Court was wondering that too. And they wanted the prayer to be non-sectarian. Now, my opinion is that that's an oxymoron, the idea of a non-sectarian prayer. But this is what they wanted, and this is what they came up with. It became known as the Regent's Prayer, and in the Engle case is sometimes referred to as the Regent's Prayer case. And this is what the prayer said. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Now, it seems innocuous enough, I suppose, but you know that it does promote sectarian notions of monotheism, supernatural creation, and divine response to petitions. The first two words, Almighty God, are already sectarian in nature, excluding atheists and religions that believe in multiple gods. Now, the Regent's Prayer was recommended to local school districts, but they didn't have to use it. They didn't have to use any prayer, but in fact, if they wanted to start the day with a prayer, this was the one that they had to use. Now, initially, on Long Island, only about 10% of the school districts used it, and the New York City schools did not. Now, I want to, sort of move forward a little bit here, but talk about the cultural and social context of the Engle versus Vitale case. The 1940s and 50s brought great changes to Long Island, culturally, socially, religiously, and politically. The Engel family, my family, moved to Long Island in 1953 from Brooklyn. This was a time of the baby boom. This was the time of people coming back. My father had served in World War II, and so he could get a real good price on a mortgage for his house, VA mortgage, and a lot of people were doing that. So Long Island had been farmland. Today, you got to go way out to Suffolk to find any farms. But at that time, a lot of Long Island, including Nassau, was farmland, but developers were buying it up and building houses. And so the Engel family, like lots of people in New York City, said, we want to get out of the city. You know, the city was associated with living in tenements, and it's dirty, and it's crowded, and oh, the American dream was to move to a house in the suburbs on Long Island, or maybe Westchester, but in this case, Long Island. That was sort of the American dream. Move to the suburbs, get out of that terrible city and move to the suburbs. The irony of that is that today on Long Island, kids grow up saying, boy, I hope I can live in Manhattan someday. Things have changed. But in those days, that was the dream for people. Let's get out of the city and move to the suburbs. And so, like I said, the Engel family in 1953 moved from Brooklyn to Long Island. And a lot of people were doing this as well. And so the farmland's being turned into housing, and people are having lots and lots of babies. Now, this caused some social tensions in the New Hyde Park area. Again, it's the Herrick schools, and the town was called New Hyde Park. And New Hyde Park had been a largely Catholic working-class area, where many people sent their kids to parochial school. And now you had this kind of influx of outsiders. And many of them, not all, but many of them were not Catholic. And they wanted to send their kids to public school. And in the state of New York, as in many states, most of public school financing comes from local property taxes. So people who had been living in this area for a long time and who did not send their kids to public school, send their kids to parochial school, all of a sudden were faced with large tax increases on their property that were needed to build schools for these outsiders who had just gotten here. And that bred resentment, and in a lot of ways, you know, I can understand that. But of course, fear of change and fear of newcomers and fear of others frequently engenders reactionary type reactions. And so in July of 1958, the Herrick School Board voted to start using the Regent's Prayer to start every school day in every class. Now, there was a lawyer for the board. His name was Herb Ballin. I used to play baseball with his son Joey. And he was the board's attorney, and he gave them an opinion that the prayer was unconstitutional. And so, faced with a contrary opinion from their own legal expert, the board took action. They fired him. They said, we're doing this, and that's it, period. We're not going to listen to anybody else. Now, the prayer's instituted, and kids being kids, you know, they mumble the words. They just sort of, whatever I'm supposed to say, yeah, what am I supposed to say, yeah, whatever it is, I'll say it. And that's one of the reasons why, although for some religious people it's a matter of freedom, but also some religious people don't like the idea of this kind of prayer in school because it kind of diminishes prayer. It takes it out of its context and makes it sort of meaningless. And so some religious people are against, you know, like this type of prayer in school for that particular reason. Now, my older brother Mike, by the way, this is 1958, the year I was born. But I had an older brother Mike, who was born in 1951, was 7 years old at this time, and he was in school. And he comes home from school. My father, of course, how was your school day? What did you do? Tells him about the prayer. And my brother says, and the teacher taught us how to pray. My father said, what? And remember, my father's Jewish, my mother's Jewish. You know, I was raised in a Jewish family. I don't practice it so much myself these days, but I do consider myself culturally and ethnically Jewish. And my father said, what are you talking about? And my brother said, well, the teacher said you clap your hands together like this, and you look at the ceiling, and then you say the Regent's Prayer. And my father said, we don't pray that way. And he was very unhappy about this. And if you think that, well, it's not that big a deal, I've got a hypothetical for you. Take the very same Regent's Prayer, this very same words. And suppose the teacher said, okay, children, we're going to say the morning Regent's Prayer, and here's how we're going to do it. I've got a prayer mat for each one of you. And the prayer, make sure your prayer mat faces the window, which is east. That's where Mecca is. And you get down on your prayer mat, on your knees, and bend over, touch your head to the floor, and say those exact same words of the Regent's Prayer. And you tell me you don't think people are going to get upset about that? I have a feeling that people would get upset about that. Well, my father was upset about the fact that my brother was being taught to pray in a way that was against our religious traditions, or his religious traditions. And of course, what about people who don't believe in God at all? What about their rights? The atmosphere at the time was that such people were dangerous communists who had no rights, but the Constitution says that they do. Now, he had next door neighbors, Larry and Fran Roth. And they had two sons in school, Dan and Joe, who were a little older than my brother Mike. And Larry was a non-religious person who was incensed that his kids were being compelled to pray. He thought that religious instruction was the prerogative of parents and not the duty of the state. And so Larry contacted the New York Civil Liberties Union. They warned him of potential repercussions, but said if he wanted to go forward, that they would hire him a lawyer. And the lawyer who took the case was William Butler, Esquire. And he said to Larry, get as many co-plaintiffs as you can. It'll look better in court that way. And my father was the first one to sign on to be a co-plaintiff with Larry. Again, unlike Larry, Dad was a religious man, but he thought this prayer diminished religion and was divisive. And he also, my parents were very concerned with civil rights, and not just their own, but everybody's. My parents were founding members of the Nassau County chapter of the ACLU. In 1963, my mother got on a bus to go to Washington to join the March on Washington and to hear Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. So my parents were very concerned about civil liberties, and they felt, hey, even forgetting about what we feel, if our friend Larry Roth doesn't want his kids to pray, that's his right, and we're going to back him up on it. So, hey, come on in. So, at first, many other people said that they would back up Larry too. There were a lot of people who said that they were going to join this lawsuit. But at the last minute, a lot of people backed out. I can't emphasize enough, and we'll see that we'll get to this in a minute, that this was a scary thing to do. You know, the teachers in the schools, they were compelled to lead the prayer, whether they wanted to or not. And some didn't mind, but some of them did. But what were they going to do? They really had no choice. They were told, you have to, this is part of your job, you have to do it. And remember, they were also intimidated, at least some of them, to oppose the prayer granted you not only anti-religion, but also pro-communist. And you remember what happened to people deemed pro-communist in those days. You could lose your job and be blackballed from getting another one. So Larry Roth and Steve Engel went to the board and said to them, listen, we don't want to bring a lawsuit, but you know, we've got to do something about this policy. And the board said, absolutely not, forget it. And so they sued. And they were joined by 3 other plaintiffs. In the end, there were only 5 plaintiffs. There were Larry Roth, Steve Engel, Lenore Lyons, Dan Lichtenstein, and Monroe Lerner. And so began the case of Engel versus Vitale. By the way, William Vitale, just so you know, was the president of the school board at the time, and that's why his name is attached to the case. Now, a local newspaper called the plaintiffs atheistic commies. And you see how those words go together in those days. And there were letters to the editor that they printed along the lines of, go back to Russia, you Jew bastards. Very Christian of them, don't you think? But the furor over the case died down a bit as the case wound its way through the courts, and probably part of the reason for this is that the plaintiffs kept losing initially. But I want to bring up something else very quickly that I think is really important and gets to the heart of some of the nature of religious liberty, and religious liberty in this case. And that is, my father and Larry and the plaintiffs and anybody else who had any objection to this prayer were faced with a terrible choice, because technically the prayer was voluntary. So parents could sign a piece of paper, then give it to the school and say, I want my kids to get up and leave the classroom when the prayer is being said. And of course, this had terrible social repercussions for the kids who did. They were ostracized. They were beaten up. They were bullied. It was a terrible thing. Now, Larry had his kids leave. He felt that that was the way to do it, and I know they were scarred by it. My father did not have my brother leave the classroom. He said, just mumble the words, we'll take care of this outside. It wasn't that my father thought that this was the right thing to do necessarily. He just felt terrible. He knew that by getting involved in this case, that he was making life for his family difficult, and he just couldn't bear to make it any worse for my brother than it already was. But I gotta tell you something. No, people talk about religious liberty. What about the religious liberty of these people? What about they're faced with a decision where they either have to have their child participate in a religious exercise that goes against their beliefs, goes against their religion, or have their child suffer ostracism and bullying and beatings in school. That was the choice. That is immoral. That is morally wrong to force people to be into a choice like that. It should never, ever happen. And you talk about freedom of religion. What about the freedom of religion of the people in the school at that time? Now, the trial was held in the New York State Supreme Court for the County of Nassau. That's the trial court in New York. And Attorney Butler emphasized that plaintiffs are not against religion. They just want to keep religious indoctrination in the home and in the church where it belongs. We are actually protecting religious liberty for all. Religious liberty includes being able to practice whatever religion you want, in whatever way you want, or to not practice religion at all, if that is your preference. That is true religious liberty. Now, the plaintiffs lost in the trial court, and they appealed to the appellate division, and they lost in the appellate division. And then they asked the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York, to take the case. They did, and they lost there too. But there were two dissents in the Court of Appeals, and one of which made an essential point, which was, and this is Justice Fold, who said, an immature child is unable to resist because of his inherent desire to conform. Remember, the defendants basically, which was the school board, basically had there were two arguments to their defense. One is the prayer is non-sectarian, and we sort of talked about that already. And the other one is that it's voluntary. But you see, it's nonsense, the idea that it's voluntary. And the judge from the Court of Appeals caught that when he said that an immature child is unable to resist because of his inherent desire to conform. So the plaintiffs asked the United States Supreme Court to grant certiorari and to hear the case, which they did. And at Supreme Court oral argument, Attorney Butler said, the very purpose of the Constitution is to protect the minority against the majority, to protect the weak against the strong in matters keeping separate forever the functions of the civil and the religious. Now, yes, it's true that I'm sure at that time a majority of Americans were in favor of the school prayer. And it may very well be true today. But rights granted under the Constitution are not subject to popular vote. And so it didn't matter what the majority thought. If your rights are being violated, you have the right to redress. Now, the court issued its decision on June 25th, 1962. And the decision was written by Justice Hugo Black, and the decision voided the Regent's prayer and all prayers like it in the entire United States. And Black's decision stated, it is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people to recite as a part of a religious program carried on by the government. Religion is too personal, too sacred, too holy to permit its unhallowed perversion by a civil magistrate. A union of government and religion tends to destroy government and to degrade religion. Now we go back to remember what Madison said in his Memorial and Remonstrance. He argued that government suffered when religion was established, and religion suffered when it got too close to government. And actually, if you read the whole Engle decision, Justice Black quotes from the Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments. He went on to write, it is neither sacrilegious nor anti-religious to say that government should stay out of the business of writing or sanctioning official prayers and should leave that patently religious function to the people themselves. And so the prayer was struck down, and not only in the Herrick School District, but all over the country, like prayers struck down all over the country. And and we lived happily ever after. Except that we didn't. That's not what happened. Actually, what happened then was all hell broke loose. Now, this is front page news. This is New York Times front page news. This was leading the network news front page news. started then was the hate mail, the threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, or all during the day. It was really bad. We lived in, our houses, these are small houses on small plots, and people were demonstrating in front of our houses and stepping onto our property and screaming at us and threatening us. Cops standing there doing nothing. And my father, who, if you haven't guessed by now, was a tough guy, went into the garage, pulled out a shovel, and said, the next one who steps on my property gets his head bashed in. And that's when the cops finally said, okay, break it up, break it up. My father also got a phone call at work, somebody saying, we've got your kids. It wasn't true, but you could imagine the fear, because you'd seen what was going on, and it wouldn't have been all that surprising. Now, the following spring, 1963, I was 5 years old, and this is one of my earliest memories in life. I was woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of sirens. And the window of my bedroom faced the Roth house. And by the way, that same lovely local newspaper had printed the home addresses of us and Larry Roth. And of course, an act that Larry referred to as journalistic terrorism.
Yeah.
And he was right. So in any event, I wake up in the middle of the night and there's flashing lights, etc. And it was the police, the fire department had come because some local citizens had burned a cross on Larry Roth's driveway. And that's right, a cross burning in 1963, not in Mississippi, not in Alabama, not in Georgia, but in New York on Long Island. Now, that following September, I started school in kindergarten in the Herrick's Public Schools. And in fact, in 1976, I graduated from Herrick's High School. And in all the years I went to school there, I never got a single lesson or heard a single word about the Engle versus Vitale case. It was strange because I had cousins who lived elsewhere on Long Island who would, we'd see them and say, oh, we heard about the Engle versus Vitale case. Not in the school, not in that school. I think the administrators were afraid. They knew the violent passions that had been unleashed by the case, and it scared them, and they thought we should not mention this at all, and they didn't. And to be honest with you, it probably saved me from getting beaten up on more than one occasion, so I'm not really going to complain about it, but I thought that was very interesting. Now, of course, as Janice mentioned in her opening remarks, the holding of the Engle case and other such cases are violated on a regular basis today. And we know that organizations like AU and the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion Foundation will step in, but they can only step in certain ways. AU lawyers can write a letter to a school district and say, what you're doing is wrong, you better not do it anymore, and sometimes that'll work. But if it doesn't, if it doesn't work, and a lawsuit has to be brought, somebody has to act as a plaintiff. Somebody in good standing has to act as a plaintiff. Somebody in the community has to stand up and say, I will be the plaintiff for that case. And that, as you've seen, takes a tremendous amount of courage. And so I believe that we owe such people a real debt of gratitude. People like Larry Roth, Steve Engel, Dan Lichtenstein, Lenore Lyons, Mike Lerner, and their families as well. We owe these people a great debt of gratitude. They put themselves at risk in order to protect the rights of everyone. Thank you very much. I just want to mention real quick that there's some handouts there about my blog. If you want to follow my blog, I write about separation of church and state and a few other issues as well. If you have any other groups that would want me as a speaker, I am based in New York City, so logistically we'd have to work it out, but my email address is on the flyer too, so you can feel free to email me. Also, just if any of you members of AU, you'll be getting the Church and State. I will have an essay in the January edition of Church and State. So I'll open up the floor if anybody has any questions or comments, etc. Yes?
You mentioned about this happening in New York, not in Mississippi. That was something that came to mind first. Like, I was surprised this wasn't something that was going on in the Bible Belt. Was there also at the same time problems going on in the Bible Belt in the 60s, or?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I mean, but this was very, the idea of school prayer was very common at the time. But this was the first place where people had actually really challenged it. So yes, there was, so this was, again, that's part of the reason why this was national news. I mean, because, yes, of course, like many Supreme Court cases, it may involve a very small, just a few people or something like that. Like Obergefell involved, two people who of the same sex who wanted to get married, but boy, does that have implications over the entire country. And so, yeah, it was very common. Again, it's, like we said, it's still common, but it was very common throughout the country at the time to have prayers that led school, to the school day. Yes?
I grew up in Nassau County in the 50s and 60s, and my parents were Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So I was one of those people that would have to stand up through the Pledge of Allegiance and then leave for the prayer.
Right.
It was hell.
Yeah.
It was absolutely
It was
hell.
absolutely, well, you know how it is with kids. Any difference is going to be, picked on, etc. And especially in an atmosphere like this, and where they're being egged on by these so-called adults in the community about, screaming and yelling and calling names and atheistic commies and all the rest of that. Well, the kids are going to pick up on that. Not only are they going to pick up on that, they're going to call that free license to do whatever the heck they want.
It always felt like a sham. I grew up in a Jewish area,
Uh-huh.
so all of my teachers were Jewish, all of my friends were Jewish. It felt like a complete sham, but that's what happened every day.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, again, I mentioned it was in some ways a sham. I mean, and we always, the old joke about the Pledge of Allegiance, where kids say, and to the Republic for Richard stands, and then afterwards say, who the heck is Richard Stands anyway? I mean, who is this guy that we're saying some sort of thing to? Because it waters it down. And again, that's why some people who are religious people in their lives, are also against the idea of having this watered down, meaningless prayer at the beginning of the day. Yes, anybody else?
For the lower courts, what was the grounds for not finding in favor of the defendants?
And mostly, I think they tracked what ultimately became the dissent in the Supreme Court case. Remember, it was a 6-1 decision. Of course, we all know there are 9 Supreme Court justices, but there was a vacancy at the time on the court. That's why, in fact, President Kennedy had nominated Byron White for the court, but he hadn't been approved yet by the Senate. And Justice Frankfurter was ill, and so he couldn't participate in oral argument, and so he recused himself from the decision. Not that it would have mattered, since it was 6-1, and even if they had voted on the other way, it would have been 6-3. But Justice Potter Stewart wrote the dissent, and he did what I think a lot of people do, which I think is a misreading, if I may be so bold to talk about a Supreme Court justice misreading the Constitution, but misread the Constitution to say that, as if the First Amendment said, Congress shall make no law establishing any particular religion. That's not what it says. It says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. It doesn't say any particular religion, but that's mostly where they hung their hat. They agreed with the defendants that, yeah, it's a non-sectarian prayer, and it's voluntary, and they sort of say, prayer isn't really prayer. This is a historical exercise. I mean, they twist themselves in knots, and actually, there was a case out of Massachusetts. Let me just pull out a few notes about that recently. A 2014 case called Doe versus Acton-Roxborough Regional School District, and this involved the Pledge of Allegiance. Because, in this case, parents sued because of the words under God. These were parents who did not want their children, saying what they deemed to be a prayer, etc. And the court sort of twisted itself in knots to say, well, this isn't really religious exercise. Like the word God isn't really religious. They're going to tell us that the Ten Commandments aren't really religious when they want to post them in public buildings and things like that. It's like, my God, you got to be kidding. But of course, if I were to take a spray can and deface their Ten Commandments monument, the first thing they would do is charge me with a hate crime and an anti-religion crime. But that's really, sort of what they said in the lower courts. They said, well, it's not really, it's non-sectarian, it's voluntary, and again, it's non-sectarian as long as all can participate. I mean, personally, I thought the court got wrong. I think the court gets wrong a few things, but I thought they got wrong the Town of Greece versus Galloway case, which was a case from last year in which the court held that it was okay for the Town of Greece in upstate New York to start their town meetings with a prayer. And they said, well, because it's okay as long as they, and this has gotten interesting because one of the things they also said was as long as they have different viewpoints, open to different viewpoints and different religions and things like that. As long as that's the case, then then this prayer to start is okay. And again, I think that's a misreading of the First Amendment, which doesn't talk about establishing any one religion. It talks about establishment of religion, period. So that was really where the lower courts came down on, saying it's basically okay because it's sort of a patriotic exercise. That's the case in the Massachusetts case, the Acton-Boxborough case. That's what they said. They said it's really just a quick quote from it. Although the words "under God" undeniably have a religious tinge, a religious tinge. You've got to be kidding me! Under God? What? I mean, if that's not religious, what is? Courts that have considered the history of the pledge, notwithstanding its reference to God, have found it to be a fundamentally patriotic exercise and not a religious one. And I got to tell you something, it must have taken a hell of a lot to untangle the pretzel that they wound themselves into by coming up with that decision. Obviously, they wanted to keep it, etc., but I think they made a mistake, and I think they also failed to recognize the holding in the Engle case. Because I think they failed to, one of the reasons, again, how can they say this is okay in light of the Barnett, West Virginia case? And the answer was, Barnett, West Virginia was mandatory, whereas this is voluntary. And once again, you get to the issue of, oh, kids can leave the classroom if their parents want them to, and it's like, what world do you live in? I mean, you're deciding cases, yes, they're based on the law, and they're based as the law that's written, but they can't be divorced from the real world either. And if you're in that real world, and you see, I know, because I live next door to them, I know what happened to Dan Roth and to Joe Roth when they got up and walked out at the prayer. I know that it was just, they were treated like social pariahs at best and beaten up on a regular basis at worst. So, you're going to tell me, well, it's okay because they can leave. Let me tell you something, have your kid do it. Have your kid do it, get up there, come home every day crying and with black eyes and saying, the kids won't talk to me, kids won't play with me, kids won't have anything to do with me. You suffer through that, and you turn around and tell me that that's voluntary, because I don't buy it for a minute. Yes?
You're citing that judge who gave a very restrictive interpretation of establishment of religion just to mean a state religion. I think Thomas and Scalia currently have that same opinion, right? And,
Oh, yeah.
And do you think that any other justices would have come out on the wrong side of the Engel case?
Ooh, it's one thing I thought about. I was actually thinking about it on the train down here today. It's a very good question. How would the case be decided today? I got to tell you something. I don't know that we would get the same. I hate to say it, but I don't think we would get necessarily the same decision today. Now, you can say, well, if that's the case, if I am right about that, which I hope I'm not, but if I was, why would people who want prayer in schools not just, bring suit and, and see what would happen? I think that, the court is in many ways bound by stare decisis. They don't like overturning things necessarily, especially long-standing things. And so even though I think as first impression, if it was a matter of first impression, I think there's a good chance that the Engle would have lost today, but it's not a case of first impression. so I think there's a little bit better chance. I mean, in some ways, I feel the same way about Roe versus Wade. I think that, Roe versus Wade, if it was brought today, I'm not certain that the Supreme Court would rule the same way, even though they may vote to uphold it. I'm not certain if it was a case of first impression today, that they would rule the same way that they did. So no, I have my strong doubts that the court would rule the same way in the Engle case today. But I think it continues to stand as good law, although ignored law in many ways, but continues to stand as good law, in part because of the doctrine of stare decisis and a desire not to necessarily, mess with precedent.
Anyone else?
Anyone else? We have to be out of here.
Okay, well, let's
right?
thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And before you all leave, I have one thing to say, which I thought this was wonderful. In my town, I live in South Jersey, in a small town called Clayton. And in the town of Clayton, we have a town seal that has 4 symbols on it. A man rowing in a boat, a big industrial building, a school, and a church with a Christian cross on it. And Americans United has been asking me for a long time if I would please consider speaking out against this town, speaking out against my town seal in my town, which is a very small town. And now that both of my kids are out of high school, I have filed a complaint with Americans United and taking on the town seal of Clayton, New Jersey, and I expect crosses to be burned on my lawn and firebombing. I was ostracized in 2003 when I simply spoke out against the seal in the newspaper. And people were giving me nasty looks in Acme and giving me nasty looks in the Elks Lodge. I couldn't go anywhere, I couldn't do anything. My kids were getting harassed in school. We're all going to go to hell. And it was pretty bad for a couple of years till the hubbub died down and I said I wasn't going to sue the town. And that's no longer true. I am going to sue the town. Well, no. I'm going to ask them to hold a contest town-wide to ask everybody to please come up with a new idea for an inclusive town seal that includes everybody and embodies every resident of Clayton. We have people from India, Pakistan, China, Turkey. We have residents from all around the world, and we need to reflect our diversity in our town seal. So, wish me luck. I don't know what I'm going to do. That's my last announcement, and don't forget to see us on December 6th at the Kitzmiller versus Dover event, and everything's on our website at dvau.org. Thank you very much.
What's that?
The lakes, I just got finished with work. Came directly from work.
We were expecting, there were like 70 other people who speak up, so they were right here. And she was also expecting a training group.
Yeah. Used to do, a lot of times there's more because to get people from her. She does Facebook.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Oh, totally.
Just depends. You need a, usually a lot of people are asking you don't come.
Yeah, they're just kind of like checking it off just to maybe get their own
Maybe
reminder.
I will. I'm thinking about it. At least let some people I'm thinking about.
Oh, yeah.
That's not something where you need to resort to table or something like that.
I actually wasn't planning on going on my trainer conference, so I'll be the next, I was only already in the city, because I work at 18 Walnut.
There's a bank account and tax ID on
Fantastic.
the
Yeah.
and a
That's a
website.
lot to take, is that not a lot for
Exactly,
someone?
yeah.
That's a lot to
Yeah,
take.
that was a little bit before I was born. I was born in 65.
Oh, it's
Gotcha.
DVAU.
Oh, you were born in
So this will be up on our YouTube probably in a couple days, maybe it's a little slow. It's DVAU video.
That was fantastic.
No, I didn't get the post yet. I don't bring it back. So
Yes, that's right.
it's all my camera.
Although I
I will be
was
posting
on
that soon.
the TV show.
Front row seat.
And your website.